Imagine a dream kept alive not for years or decades, but for 2 millennia. A hope whispered across generations, across continents, in times of peace, and in the darkest hours of human history. This is the story of the creation of the State of Israel. It is a story of ancient roots, geopolitical chess, unimaginable tragedy, and fierce determination. It is a narrative that fundamentally reshaped the Middle East and the world. To understand the events of 1948, we must first look back. For over 2,000 years, following the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE, the Jewish people lived in the Diaspora. Scattered across the globe, from the banks of the Tigris to the cities of Spain and eventually to the villages of Eastern Europe, they remained bound together by religion, text, culture, and a deep-seated yearning to return to their ancestral homeland. A land known historically and in their daily prayers as Zion. However, for centuries, this return was largely seen as a spiritual inevitability, a messianic prophecy rather than a political objective. Throughout this long exile, small Jewish communities maintained a continuous presence in holy cities like Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron. Yet the land itself was ruled by a succession of empires: the Byzantines, the Arab Caliphates, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. Over these centuries, a vibrant Arab population established deep, undeniable roots, building a rich society and culture on that very same soil. By the late 19th century, the landscape of Europe was changing. The continent was swept up in the fervor of nationalism, with peoples everywhere seeking self-determination. But for the Jewish people, this era of nation-building brought a terrifying surge of violent anti-Semitism. Most notably, the brutal state-sanctioned pogroms in the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a loyal Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason amidst rampant public anti-Semitism, shattered the illusion that assimilation would guarantee safety. Out of this crisis emerged a radical new idea: political Zionism. Its most famous champion was an Austro-Hungarian journalist named Theodor Herzl. Witnessing the Dreyfus trial firsthand, Herzl concluded that the only way for Jews to escape perpetual persecution was to establish their own sovereign nation. In 1896, he published a pamphlet titled Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State. The following year, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. He transformed a 2,000-year-old religious yearning into a modern, organized political movement. Driven by this vision and fleeing violence in Eastern Europe, small waves of Jewish immigrants, known as Aliyah, began arriving in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. These early pioneers, fueled by socialist ideals and a desire to work the land, bought property, drained malaria-infested swamps, and established collective agricultural communities known as Kibbutzim. They also sparked a cultural revolution, most notably through the efforts of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who miraculously revived Hebrew from an ancient liturgical language into a modern, spoken tongue. But the geopolitical map of the world was about to shatter. In 1914, the globe plunged into the First World War. The Ottoman Empire allied with Germany, sealing its own fate. As the British Empire pushed into the Middle East to secure the Suez Canal and defeat the Ottomans, they made a series of conflicting, desperate promises to secure local support. In the Hussein McMahon correspondence, they essentially promised Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Turks. Yet, simultaneously, They were secretly carving up the region with the French in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Then came a document containing just 67 words that would alter the course of the 20th century. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration. Influenced by strategic wartime interests and the tireless lobbying of Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, it stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. For the Zionists, it was a monumental diplomatic victory, an international validation of their cause. But for the Arab majority living in Palestine, it was seen as a profound betrayal of the promises made for their own independence. Following the war, the newly formed League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine. The British were tasked with an incredibly contradictory mission: facilitating the Jewish national home while safeguarding the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. It was a balancing act that proved impossible to execute. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Jewish immigration surged. With them came capital, modern technology, and the rapid development of infrastructure. The Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, began building the institutions of a state within a state, including a shadow government, a labor federation, and an underground defense force called the Haganah. The city of Tel Aviv rose from the sand dunes on the Mediterranean coast. But as the Jewish population grew, so did Palestinian Arab fears of demographic displacement and the loss of their homeland. Tensions boiled over into horrific violence. Riots in 1920 and the devastating Hebron massacre in 1929 deepened the divide. In 1936, the Arab population launched a massive 3-year revolt against both British rule and Jewish immigration. They staged general strikes and engaged in armed rebellion. Caught in the middle, the British attempted to appease both sides, but ultimately prioritized their imperial interests. In 1937, the British Peel Commission concluded that the two communities' aspirations were irreconcilable and proposed the first ever partition of the land. The Arabs rejected it completely.
You think you can hide this?
The Jews debated it
I'm not hiding
fiercely.
anything from you. Then explain
Ultimately,
the evidence. I can't!
the British shelved
This ends
the
now.
plan
What are
and
you doing?
violently crushed the Arab revolt. Then, in 1939, on the very eve of the Second World War, Britain issued the infamous White Paper, seeking to secure Arab alliances in the coming war against Germany. Britain severely restricted Jewish immigration to just 75,000 people over the next 5 years, and heavily limited Jewish land purchases. For the Jewish people, this policy locked the doors to their only refuge at the worst possible moment in human history. In Europe, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime initiated the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored, industrial-scale genocide of the Jewish people. 6 million men, women, and children were murdered, wiping out 1/3 of the global Jewish population. During these years of unimaginable horror, the doors of almost all nations, including the United States, remained closed to Jewish refugees. The British naval blockade of Palestine held firm, turning away dilapidated ships filled with desperate survivors. For the Zionist movement, the Holocaust was a devastating turning point. It transformed the idea of a Jewish state from a political aspiration into a matter of absolute, desperate survival. Never again, they vowed, would the Jewish people be left stateless, powerless, and dependent on the goodwill of others. While thousands of Jews in Palestine enlisted in the British Army to fight the Nazis, gaining crucial military experience, a profound psychological shift had occurred. They realized they could only rely on themselves. Following the war, hundreds of thousands of traumatized Jewish survivors languished in displaced persons camps across Europe. They literally had nowhere to go. A vast, clandestine network sprang up, utilizing secret routes to smuggle refugees past British blockades into Palestine. The most famous of these attempts was the ship Exodus 1947. When the British forcefully boarded the ship and deported the Holocaust survivors back to internment camps in Europe, it caused a massive international outcry and a public relations disaster for the British Empire. Simultaneously, within Palestine, hardline Jewish paramilitary groups like the Irgun and Lehi launched a fierce armed insurgency against British authorities. They attacked military bases, destroyed infrastructure, and most notoriously, bombed the British administrative headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The situation was completely spiraling out of control. Exhausted by World War II, nearly bankrupt, facing a hostile British public, and bleeding in a bloody stalemate, the British Empire finally threw its hands up. In early 1947, Britain announced it would terminate its mandate and hand the intractable problem over to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations formed a special committee to investigate. They toured the land, witnessed the tension, and visited the desperate survivors in the European camps. Their solution, presented in late 1947, was radical: partition. UN Resolution 181 proposed dividing the relatively small strip of land into two independent, interconnected states, one Jewish, one Arab. The proposed borders were a complex jigsaw puzzle. The Jewish state would consist largely of the coastal plain, the Galilee Panhandle, and the vast, empty Negev desert. The Arab state would encompass the hill country of Judea and Samaria, the Galilee highlands, and the southern coast. Jerusalem, holding immense religious significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, would not belong to either, but would become an international city administered by the UN. The Jewish leadership, led by the pragmatic David ben-Gurion, accepted the plan. It was far less land than they had historically claimed, and the borders were strategically perilous, in some places only miles wide. But it offered the ultimate prize: international recognition of a sovereign Jewish state. The Arab leadership, both in Palestine and across the surrounding nations, categorically rejected the resolution. They viewed the UN plan as an unjust theft of indigenous Arab land, an imposition by guilt-ridden Western powers, and a continuation of colonialism. They vowed to fight the partition by any means necessary and prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. On November 29, 1947, the world watched as the UN General Assembly voted. 33 nations in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The partition plan passed. As Jewish communities around the world erupted in joyous celebration, dancing in the streets, the Arab Higher Committee declared a general strike. Fighting broke out almost immediately. A brutal, localized civil war erupted across the Mandate as British forces began their chaotic, uncoordinated withdrawal. Arab militias blockaded Jewish settlements and laid a suffocating siege to Jerusalem, cutting off 100,000 Jewish residents from food and water. Jewish forces, initially on the defensive, soon launched a massive counter-offensive to secure the territory allotted to them by the UN, taking control of mixed cities like Haifa and Jaffa. This period marked the beginning of what Palestinians call the Nakba, or the Catastrophe. As the intense fighting raged, fueled by fear, forced expulsions by Jewish forces, and devastating events like the massacre at the village of Deir Yassin, a mass exodus began. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled their homes, leading to the collapse of Palestinian society and creating a massive refugee crisis that remains unresolved to this day. The British Mandate was officially scheduled to expire at midnight on May 14, 1948. On the afternoon of that very day, with the British lowering their flag and gunfire echoing in the distance, Jewish leaders gathered in a small, unadorned art museum in Tel Aviv. The room was tense, the windows blacked out against potential air raids. There, standing under a portrait of Theodor Herzl, David ben-Gurion struck a wooden gavel and read the Declaration of Independence. His voice was steady as he spoke the words that ended a 2,000-year wait. By virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. Within hours, President Harry Truman of the United States granted de facto recognition to the new nation, quickly followed by the Soviet Union. But there was no time for celebration. The very next day, the regular armies of 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War had begun. The Israelis call it the War of Independence. They were fighting not just for territory, but for their very existence. They believed defeat meant a second Holocaust. Despite being initially outgunned, lacking an air force, and relying on smuggled, improvised weaponry, the newly formed Israel Defense Forces fought with the desperate ingenuity of a people with their backs to the sea. They secretly carved a dirt path through the mountains, the famous Burma Road, to bypass the Arab blockade and save the starving population of Jerusalem. The cost of survival was staggering. 6,000 Israelis were killed, representing a full 1% of the entire Jewish population. By the time the final armistice agreements were signed in the summer of 1949, Israel had not only survived its trial by fire, but it had expanded its territory well beyond the original UN partition borders. The proposed Palestinian Arab state was never established. Transjordan occupied the West Bank, and Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. The geography of the Middle East was permanently rewritten. The creation of the State of Israel was a watershed moment in human history. It was a story of resurrection, a refuge built from the ashes of unimaginable trauma, and a triumph of unyielding human will. It immediately opened its doors, absorbing hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, and soon after, a massive influx of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Arab countries. Yet it was a state born in a crucible of violence, intertwining its triumphant destiny with the deep tragedy and displacement of the Palestinian people. Today, Israel stands as a dynamic, powerful, and technologically advanced nation, a testament to resilience and survival. But the echoes of 1948, the unresolved narratives of triumph and catastrophe, continue to reverberate loudly across the hills of Jerusalem and the world. They remind us that history is never simple, that the past is always present, and that the story of this ancient, contested land is far from over.